Imagine for a second that you're standing in a gun shop in Phoenix, Arizona on a Saturday afternoon. The place is busy, normal weekend traffic. You watch someone walk in, fill out the required paperwork, pass the background check, and purchase 3 AR-15 rifles, completely legally. Cash transaction, all above board, receipts provided. The whole process takes maybe 40 minutes. Now imagine that by Monday morning, those same 3 rifles are in the hands of a cartel enforcer in Sinaloa, Mexico. And by the end of the month, they'll be used in a firefight that kills 2 police officers and a bystander. This isn't a hypothetical. This is happening right now, every single day, and it's just one small piece of a global arms trafficking network that moves an estimated $1.4 billion worth of illegal weapons every single year. Right now, at this exact moment, there are weapons moving across borders on every continent. Rifles purchased legally in Virginia ending up with gang members in Honduras. Stockpiles looted from Libyan warehouses making their way across the Sahara to militants in Mali. Soviet-era AK-47s from Bulgarian depots being smuggled through the Balkans into Western Europe. North Korean weapons manufactured in secret facilities in Namibia. And here's the part that nobody talks about. Most of these guns don't start out illegal. They start out as legitimate purchases, legal exports, or government stockpiles. The system that's supposed to control them, the regulations, the inspections, the international treaties, all of it is riddled with gaps that traffickers exploit with remarkable efficiency. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly where illegal guns actually come from, how they move through the shadows of the legitimate arms trade, and why the system designed to stop this flow is fundamentally broken. We've been told that illegal guns come from shadowy black market dealers operating out of back alleys, that it's a completely separate world from legal gun sales. But the reality is far more disturbing. The illegal arms trade isn't a separate system, it's parasitic on the legal one. Most illegal guns start their journey as legal products, and the transformation from legal to illegal often happens through mechanisms that are shockingly simple and disturbingly difficult to prevent. This isn't just about guns ending up with criminals and terrorists, though that's certainly part of it. This is about how weak regulations in one country become a security crisis in another. How corruption at a single checkpoint can arm an entire militia. How the same logistics networks that move consumer goods also move weapons. How governments themselves, even democratic ones, sometimes quietly facilitate arms flows they publicly condemn. And if you think this doesn't affect you, consider this. The instability created by illegal arms flows drives refugee crises, fuels conflicts that destabilize entire regions, empowers criminal organizations that traffic drugs into your community, and undermines governments that are supposed to be your allies. The guns flowing illegally across borders don't stay there. Their effects ripple outward. Let's start with the region that produces and exports more illegal weapons than anywhere else on Earth, and you probably already know which country I'm talking about. The United States is the single largest source of illegal firearms in the Western Hemisphere, and understanding how this works requires understanding just how easy it is to legally purchase guns in America and then illegally traffic them across borders. Every year, approximately 200,000 firearms are trafficked from the United States into Mexico. Let that number sink in, 200,000. That's not over a decade, that's annually. And these aren't just handguns. We're talking semi-automatic rifles, AR-15s, AK variants, 50 caliber sniper rifles that can pierce armored vehicles, the kind of firepower that allows cartel enforcers to outgun Mexican police and military. A recent report to Mexico's Congress found that at least 74% of illegal weapons seized from organized crime in Mexico came through trafficking routes originating in the United States, 3/4. The cartels aren't manufacturing these weapons. They're not smuggling them in from overseas. They're buying them, often legally, a few hours' drive north of the border. Here's how the system works, and here's where you'll see just how simple it is. In the United States, particularly in states along the Mexican border like Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, gun laws are relatively permissive. In many jurisdictions, private sales don't require background checks. Gun shows operate with minimal oversight. Straw purchasing, where someone with a clean record buys guns on behalf of someone who can't legally purchase them, is illegal but extremely difficult to prosecute unless you catch them in the act. So here's the typical pattern. A cartel identifies someone in the US who has no criminal record, often someone struggling financially who's willing to make some quick money. This person, called a straw buyer, goes to gun shops or gun shows and makes legal purchases. Sometimes it's 1 or 2 guns at a time to avoid suspicion. Sometimes it's more. The purchased firearms are then handed over to cartel intermediaries who smuggle them across the border. And here's the brilliant part from the trafficker's perspective. Most border security is focused on northbound traffic, looking for drugs and people coming into the United States. Southbound traffic receives far less scrutiny. Guns are hidden in vehicles, concealed in cargo, strapped to the underside of trucks. Law enforcement data shows that most cross-border gun seizures involve fewer than 5 firearms at once, because trafficking in small quantities is easier and less risky. If you get caught with 2 rifles, that's a relatively minor charge. If you get caught with 50, you're looking at serious federal time. So the flow is steady, distributed, and hard to stop. The types of weapons being trafficked have evolved over time. And this tells you something about what the cartels want and how they're using them. In the early 2000s, it was mostly handguns. Concealable, easy to smuggle, good for street-level violence. But over the past 15 years, there's been a dramatic shift toward rifles. Between 2016 and 2022, there was a 105% increase in rifles traced back to the US and seized in Mexico. Why rifles? Because the cartels are fighting increasingly militarized battles with Mexican security forces, and they need firepower. A .50 caliber rifle can disable a vehicle or shoot through a wall. An AR-15 with a high-capacity magazine can suppress an entire police squad. These aren't weapons for muggings. These are weapons for war. And it's not just Mexico. US-sourced firearms show up throughout Central America and the Caribbean. Gangs in Jamaica prize American-made handguns for their reliability and status. Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador all see regular seizures of weapons traced back to the United States. Haiti's exploding gang warfare over the past few years has been fueled in part by weapons smuggled from Florida. The pattern is consistent: legal purchase in the US, illegal export to a country with strict gun laws, use in violent crime. But the United States isn't the only source in the Americas, and here's where it gets interesting, because the second largest source is a country most people wouldn't expect: Paraguay. Small, landlocked, with a population of only about 7 million, Paraguay has become a critical node in South American arms trafficking. Why? Because Paraguay has significantly more permissive gun laws than its neighbors, particularly Brazil and Argentina. In Paraguay, legal gun ownership is relatively common, prices are cheaper than in surrounding countries, and enforcement is weak. This creates a perfect arbitrage opportunity. Guns that are legally purchased in Paraguay get smuggled across porous borders into Brazil, where gun laws are much stricter and black market prices are much higher. The same weapons then feed criminal organizations in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, where gang violence is a chronic problem. Some of these guns also flow into Argentina. The Paraguayan government has acknowledged the problem but lacks the resources and, frankly, the political will to crack down effectively. Border checkpoints are few and far between. Corruption is endemic, and the economic incentive for traffickers is strong. You can buy a pistol legally in Paraguay for a few $100s and sell it illegally in Brazil for double or triple that. Now let's shift to a completely different part of the world where the sources and methods are dramatically different. In Africa, the primary source of illegal weapons isn't new manufacturing or legal purchases gone wrong. It's old stockpiles, looted arsenals, and the lingering remnants of decades of conflict. After the Cold War ended, vast quantities of weapons that had been supplied by the Soviet Union and the United States to various African governments and rebel groups didn't just disappear. They stayed in the region, often in poorly secured armories or abandoned altogether. When governments collapse or rebel groups overrun military bases, those stockpiles get looted, and the weapons flow into the black market. The clearest example of this is Libya. In 2011, during the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, government armories were raided across the country. We're talking about millions of small arms, machine guns, anti-aircraft weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, all of it suddenly available to whoever could grab it. Some stayed in Libya, fueling the ongoing civil conflict, but huge quantities flowed south across the Sahara into Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and beyond. A study of weapons captured from militant groups in the Sahel region found that only about 7% came from post-2011 Libyan smuggling. The rest were decades-old arms that had been sitting in West African military stockpiles and were diverted during rebellions and state collapses. In fact, about 1/4 of weapons captured from Sahel insurgents were originally in the arsenals of the Malian, Burkinabe, or Nigerian militaries, before being seized in combat or stolen during mutinies. This tells you something crucial. The problem isn't new weapons flooding in from outside. The problem is that Africa is awash in weapons from previous conflicts, and the infrastructure to control them barely exists. Armories are underguarded. Soldiers are underpaid and susceptible to bribery. Record keeping is spotty. When a military unit collapses or switches sides, their weapons go with them. But there's another source in Africa that's far more secretive and far more troubling, and it involves a country that's been under international sanctions for decades, yet somehow continues to export weapons across the globe: North Korea. Most people know that North Korea sells weapons to rogue states and non-state actors to generate hard currency and survive sanctions. But what most people don't know is that North Korean weapons haven't just been exported into Africa. In some cases, they've been manufactured there. Take Namibia. In the mid-2000s, a North Korean state company quietly helped build what was officially described as an ammunition factory just outside Windhoek, the capital. On paper, it was a joint industrial project. In reality, it was a weapons production facility. Years later, Namibia actually admitted to the United Nations that North Korean teams had built and equipped the facility, a direct violation of UN sanctions. But by then, the factory was operational and the North Koreans had been paid. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a similar pattern. North Korean engineers helped set up and upgrade 2 weapons manufacturing complexes, one for rifles and military equipment, another for ammunition. Officially, these were presented as industrial cooperation projects. In reality, they were arms production facilities that gave the Congolese military domestic manufacturing capacity while providing North Korea with cash and diplomatic leverage. In Uganda, North Korean military advisors have long trained local forces, and reports indicate they've assisted at Ugandan arms factories and repair facilities. The scale of this is hard to measure because North Korea operates in secrecy, and the African governments involved have no incentive to be transparent. But the pattern is clear. North Korea exports not just weapons, but the capability to manufacture weapons, creating new sources of supply that feed into regional conflicts and black markets. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because this exact scenario was exposed in the documentary The Mole, where undercover footage captured North Korean officials negotiating a deal to build a hidden underground weapons factory on an African island, a facility that would produce everything from rifles to missile components, sealed beneath farmland so the world would never detect it. We have no idea how many of these facilities exist or how much of the weaponry circulating in African conflicts originates from them, but the evidence suggests it's significant. So we know where some of the guns in Africa come from, but how do they move? How does a weapon looted from a Libyan base in Benghazi end up in the hands of a militant in northern Mali 1,000 miles away? The answer is a network of smuggling routes that have existed for centuries, repurposed for modern arms trafficking. First, you have the trans-Saharan land routes. After Libya collapsed, cheap rifles and ammunition became available, and the ancient caravan trails that once moved salt and gold across the desert became arms trafficking corridors. Convoys of 4x4s and pickup trucks loaded with weapons drive south from Libya through Niger and Mali, avoiding major roads and checkpoints. When they do encounter checkpoints, bribes take care of the problem. The Sahara is vast, borders are unmonitored, and governments have limited capacity to patrol remote areas. Then you have coastal and maritime smuggling. Along the West African coast and up the Gulf of Guinea, small boats and fishing vessels move weapons between ports. Larger commercial ships can conceal weapons in cargo containers that pass through ports with weak inspection capacity. A rifle hidden among a shipment of electronics or textiles is almost impossible to detect without physically unloading and inspecting the entire container. And customs agencies don't have the resources to do that for more than a tiny fraction of shipments. In Central Africa, lakes and rivers serve as smuggling corridors. Lake Tanganyika, Lake Chad, the Congo River system, all of these are used to move weapons. Small boats, sometimes just canoes, can carry a dozen rifles and cross a border at night with almost zero chance of interdiction. The infrastructure to patrol these waterways doesn't exist. So you have land routes across deserts, sea routes along coastlines, and river routes through jungles, all moving weapons from surplus zones to conflict zones. And who's buying these weapons at the end of the line? In Africa, it's mostly non-state armed groups, jihadist organizations like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and affiliates of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Rebel movements fighting against governments they see as illegitimate or oppressive. Ethnic militias protecting their communities in the absence of effective state security. Warlords consolidating power in collapsed states. And yes, some organized crime, but in Africa, the primary market is conflict, not crime. Now let's move to a region where state actors play a much more direct role in arms trafficking, often using official channels and then lying about it. The Middle East. In the Middle East, illegal arms flows are driven by a toxic mix of state sponsorship, battlefield captures, diverted shipments, and surplus markets. Surplus markets refer to leftover weapons from past wars or overproduction that governments, militaries, or factories sell off legally, but which then quietly leak into illegal hands through corrupt brokers, falsified paperwork, or deliberate diversion. In the Middle East, one country stands out above all others as a state sponsor of arms trafficking, and that's Iran. Iran has become one of the region's most prolific covert suppliers, shipping rifles, missiles, rocket components, and ammunition to allied militias and proxy forces across the region. The Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, all of them receive Iranian weapons, and the delivery methods are remarkably consistent. Iranian smugglers use small dhows, traditional wooden boats that blend in perfectly with legitimate fishing traffic in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. These vessels carry weapons hidden beneath fishing nets, inside cargo holds modified with false compartments, or simply stacked on deck and covered with tarps. Between 2015 and 2024, US and allied naval forces intercepted at least 18 maritime shipments of Iranian weapons bound for Yemen. Some of these shipments were relatively low-tech, crates of AK-47s and machine guns that could have come from anywhere, but others contained advanced military hardware, anti-tank guided missiles, surface-to-air missiles, ballistic missile components, sophisticated equipment that clearly came from state arsenals. The fact that these shipments keep happening despite regular interdictions tells you something important. Iran is willing to accept a certain loss rate because enough shipments get through to make it worthwhile. And here's the other player you've probably guessed by now: North Korea. North Korean-made weapons have surfaced in conflict zones across the Middle East in the hands of non-state actors who theoretically shouldn't have access to them. Hamas in Gaza has been found with North Korean weapons. Houthi militants in Yemen have North Korean arms. UN investigators documented attempts by North Korean brokers to supply small arms to various groups through intermediaries operating in the region. North Korea doesn't ship directly. They use cutouts, middlemen, brokers who can provide plausible deniability. A North Korean diplomat meets with a representative from a Yemeni business consortium in a third country. Money changes hands. A few months later, a shipment of weapons manufactured in Pyongyang shows up in a warehouse in Yemen, having been routed through multiple countries and transshipped several times to obscure the origin. By the time anyone traces it back, the connection is almost impossible to prove definitively. So in the Middle East, you have state actors like Iran openly defying international sanctions to arm their proxies. You have North Korea quietly selling to anyone with cash. You have battlefield captures where weapons change hands during combat. And you have the constant background hum of surplus weapons from decades of conflict still circulating through the region. Now let's move to Asia, where the geography creates a completely different dynamic. In Asia, porous borders and weak state capacity make it trivially easy to move illicit arms across vast distances. The end users here include ethnic armed organizations fighting for autonomy in places like Myanmar, where groups like the Kachin, Karen, and Arakan armies have been in conflict with the central government for decades. insurgent groups in the southern Philippines, urban criminal networks in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the sources are diverse: North Korea, China, and most importantly, looted stockpiles from collapsed or collapsing states. The clearest example of stockpile capture in recent years happened in August 2021 when the Afghan government collapsed. The Taliban took power in a matter of days, and in the process, they seized air bases, depots, and enormous quantities of American-supplied military equipment. Within weeks, they were parading captured American-made vehicles and weapons through the streets of Kabul. Estimates suggest the Taliban acquired tens of thousands of rifles, thousands of vehicles, helicopters, night vision equipment, communications gear, all of it originally provided to the Afghan military by the United States and now in the hands of the Taliban. Some of that equipment will stay in Afghanistan, but plenty will leak into the broader regional arms market. A Taliban commander who has more rifles than fighters might sell the surplus. A corrupt official might divert equipment to a broker who can move it across the border. This is how state collapse feeds the illegal arms trade. But looted stockpiles are just one source. The primary smuggling routes in Asia follow the same paths as every other underground commodity. Old trails used for centuries, crowded sea lanes where inspection is impossible, and borders where governments have little reach. The biggest artery runs through the Afghan-Pakistani frontier, the tribal areas where Islamabad's authority has always been tenuous at best. Weapons left behind after decades of conflict, Soviet-era arms from the 1980s, American weapons from the 2000s, all of it flows freely across this porous border. From there, some weapons travel west into Iran and Iraq, others move north into the Central Asian republics. They're packed in trucks, hidden under loads of legitimate cargo, handled by brokers who've been in the business for generations. Farther east, another cluster of routes connects China to Southeast Asia. Chinese-made rifles and ammunition slip across the border into Myanmar, then travel south through jungle paths and along the Mekong River into Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. In the Golden Triangle, the region where Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos meet, these weapons mix with the area's booming methamphetamine and heroin trade. The same brokers who move drugs also move guns because both generate cash and both rely on the same infrastructure of corruption. Customs officials who look the other way for drug shipments will do the same for weapons shipments if the price is right. Down at the coast, shipping containers and small boats carry weapons through the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca. These are often factory-made guns or component parts mixed into normal commercial cargo and re-exported multiple times before reaching their destination. And here's the scale problem. The Strait of Malacca facilitates the passage of over 40% of global trade. Tens of thousands of ships pass through every year. Finding illegal weapons in that volume of traffic is like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. You'd need to inspect every container on every ship, which is physically and economically impossible. In archipelago nations like the Philippines and Indonesia, smugglers use fast boats to hop between islands, dropping off small loads to gangs and militant groups scattered along thousands of miles of coastline. There are so many islands, so much coastline, so little state presence that interdiction is nearly impossible. It's a smuggler's paradise. But not all weapons in Asia come from external sources. Local manufacturing plays a significant role. In Pakistan's Khyber region, gunsmiths have been producing handmade copies of AK-47s and other rifles for decades. These aren't crude zip guns. These are functional, reliable weapons manufactured in small workshops using traditional metalworking techniques. They feed both domestic markets and cross-border sales. In Myanmar, rebel workshops build rifles and ammunition to arm ethnic militias fighting the central government. These aren't sophisticated operations, but they don't need to be. They're producing enough to sustain insurgencies that have been running for generations. In the Philippines, politic guns, crude and cheap handguns made in backyard foundries, fill the gap for anyone who can't legally purchase a weapon or can't afford a factory-made one. The result across Asia is a patchwork of supply chains that all feed the same demand. Insurgents need weapons to fight wars. Gangs need weapons to protect drug routes. Local power brokers need weapons to maintain control. And the combination of porous borders, weak governance, and active conflicts ensures that supply will always find demand. Now let's shift to Europe, where the dynamics are completely different because Europe isn't experiencing major wars right now. And most European countries have relatively strict gun control laws. So where do illegal guns in Europe come from? The answer is almost entirely historical. The biggest source is the Western Balkans, where the wars of the 1990s left behind an enormous residue of weapons that were never fully collected or destroyed. An estimated 6 million small arms were circulating in the Balkans after those conflicts ended. As of recent years, only about half have been recovered. That leaves potentially 3 million illegal guns still in the region, ranging from pistols to military-grade rifles to grenades and explosives. Balkan guns are prized on black markets globally because they're abundant, cheap, and largely untraceable. Over the years, these weapons have leaked north and west into the European Union. They're tucked inside trucks carrying legitimate cargo, hidden in vehicles driven through barely monitored border crossings, or simply walked across remote sections of border where there's no physical barrier and no patrols. And here's the key structural advantage for traffickers. One of the hallmarks of the European Union is open internal borders. Once a weapon is inside the EU, moving it from one country to another is relatively easy. There are no systematic border checks between most EU member states. You can drive from Greece to Germany without being stopped once. So if you can get weapons from the Balkans into an EU country, distributing them across the continent becomes straightforward. It doesn't matter if it's a gang in France or organized crime in Italy, they can access Balkan weapons relatively easily. Another stream flows from farther east, from the remnants of the old Soviet Union. Vast Cold War stockpiles of AK pattern rifles, machine guns, and ammunition once sat in depots across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics. Some of this has been legally sold off as surplus to dealers and collectors. But plenty has ended up in the hands of corrupt brokers who specialize in falsifying paperwork, altering serial numbers, and shipping crates labeled as industrial equipment that turn out to contain rifles. These flows merge with the Balkan routes and seep into Europe through the same smuggling networks used for cigarettes, drugs, and people. The infrastructure is already there. If you're moving contraband across borders, adding weapons to the mix is just another product line. But Europe also has an internal problem. Guns that are perfectly legal in one EU country get stolen, resold, or diverted into the gray market of another. Hunting rifles legally owned in the Czech Republic or Slovakia sometimes end up in the hands of criminals in France or Belgium. The regulations vary significantly between countries, and traffickers exploit those gaps. And in the last few years, a new threat has emerged that's particularly difficult to combat. 3D printed guns, sometimes called ghost guns. These are firearms manufactured using commercially available 3D printers and designs that can be downloaded from the internet. They're cheap to produce, completely untraceable because they have no serial numbers and often no metal components that would trigger detectors, and they can be shipped in pieces through regular postal systems. European law enforcement agencies have started seizing 3D printed weapons in raids from Spain to the Netherlands, and the trend is accelerating. The technology is improving, the designs are becoming more reliable, and the knowledge is spreading. This represents a fundamental shift in the illegal arms trade because it decentralizes production. You no longer need access to a factory or a smuggling network. You just need a printer and an internet connection. Together, these channels, Balkan surplus, Soviet stockpiles, internal diversion, and 3D printing form a web of supply that keeps Europe awash in illegal weapons despite strict gun laws. And who are the end users? Primarily organized crime groups who use weapons to protect drug distribution networks and enforce territorial control. Street gangs fighting over turf in cities like Marseille, Paris, and Stockholm. And occasionally, extremist cells and lone attackers looking for weapons that can't be traced back to them. But we also need to talk about a state actor that's been leveraging the gray market for weapons, and that's Russia. Since Russia's defense industry has been under international sanctions, Moscow has reportedly turned to unconventional suppliers to sustain its military operations. In late 2022, US intelligence disclosed that North Korea had shipped artillery shells and ammunition to Russia, specifically to the Wagner mercenary group fighting in Ukraine. Think about what that means. Russia, one of the world's largest arms producers, was buying ammunition from North Korea because sanctions had constrained their access to components, and their domestic production couldn't keep pace with consumption. Iran has also become a supplier to Russia, providing drones, missile components, and ballistic systems used in the conflict in Ukraine. This is the illegal arms trade operating at the state level, where countries under sanctions trade with each other to circumvent international restrictions. So now we've mapped the global landscape. We know the sources, the routes, the methods, the end users. But here's the question that really matters. Why does this system persist? Why, despite international treaties, despite billions spent on enforcement, despite countless interdictions and arrests, does the illegal arms trade continue to thrive? The answer is incentives, and understanding those incentives is the key to understanding why this problem is so difficult to solve. Let's start at the bottom of the supply chain. For the person doing the actual smuggling, the financial incentive is straightforward. A rifle that can be purchased legally in the United States for $800 might sell for $3,000 in Mexico, where legal ownership is heavily restricted. That's a nearly 400% markup. For someone struggling economically, the temptation is enormous. Even if there's risk involved, the potential reward often outweighs it, especially when the perceived likelihood of getting caught is low. For the straw buyer purchasing guns legally to hand over to traffickers, the calculation is similar. Cartels pay anywhere from a few hundred to a few $1,000s per transaction, depending on the quantity and type of weapons. For someone with no criminal record who can walk into a gun shop and make a legal purchase, it's quick money with minimal apparent risk. Most straw buyers are never caught because it's incredibly difficult to prove intent unless you have them on surveillance or a cooperating witness. For corrupt officials at borders and checkpoints, the incentive is simply bribery. A border guard in West Africa making $50 a month can earn more in a single payoff for looking the other way than he makes in 6 months of legitimate work. When your family is struggling and the system around you is already corrupt, the moral calculation becomes complicated. For brokers and middlemen who facilitate these transactions, the illegal arms trade is a business with profit margins that rival or exceed the drug trade. A broker who can connect a supplier with a buyer and arrange logistics takes a percentage of every transaction. Move enough weapons, and you're talking about serious money. And for the end users, whether they're cartels, gangs, militias, or insurgent groups, weapons are essential tools. A cartel without weapons can't protect its territory or its shipments. A militia without weapons can't fight. The demand is constant and inelastic. They will pay whatever it takes to arm themselves because the alternative is defeat or death. On the enforcement side, the incentives work against effective interdiction. Investigating arms trafficking is resource-intensive. It requires surveillance, international cooperation, forensic tracing, and often undercover operations. Most law enforcement agencies are understaffed and underfunded. They have to prioritize. A homicide investigation takes precedence over tracking down where a gun came from. A terrorism case gets more resources than a smuggling case. The result is that arms trafficking often falls through the cracks unless it's connected to a higher priority investigation. International cooperation, which is essential for tracking weapons across borders, is slow and bureaucratic. Getting information from a foreign government can take months. Extraditing a suspect can take years. And some countries simply don't cooperate because they benefit from the status quo. For governments, there's also a perverse incentive problem. Countries that produce weapons legally benefit economically from arms sales. The global legal arms trade is worth over $138 billion annually. That's jobs, tax revenue, and geopolitical influence. Cracking down too hard on the legal trade to prevent diversion into illegal channels could hurt legitimate industry. So regulations stay relatively lax, export controls have loopholes, and end-use monitoring is often inadequate. There's also the uncomfortable reality that some governments quietly facilitate arms flows they publicly condemn. A government might officially oppose a particular conflict, but tacitly allow weapons to flow to groups they secretly support. This happens more often than anyone likes to admit. Intelligence agencies have a long history of using arms shipments to arm proxies, and the line between sanctioned covert operations and illegal trafficking is often blurry. So you have a system where every actor, from the low-level smuggler to the state official, has rational incentives to participate, or at least not to interfere too aggressively. And this is why the illegal arms trade is so resilient. It's not a problem that can be solved with better technology or more arrests. It's a structural problem rooted in economics, geography, and the fundamental dynamics of supply and demand. Now let's talk about what this actually means for ordinary people, because the illegal arms trade isn't some abstract problem happening in distant countries. It has concrete consequences that ripple outward and affect everyone. Start with violence and instability. Illegal weapons fuel conflicts that kill hundreds of thousands of people and displace millions more. The Syrian civil war, the conflict in Yemen, gang violence in Central America, insurgencies in sub-Saharan Africa, all of them are sustained in part by illegal arms flows. Those conflicts create refugee crises. People fleeing violence end up in camps, in neighboring countries, or attempting dangerous journeys to reach Europe or North America. The migrant crises that have dominated political debates in Western countries for the past decade are directly connected to the instability created by armed conflict, and that conflict is sustained by weapons that often originated in those same Western countries. Then there's the economic impact. Countries dealing with internal armed conflict can't develop economically. Investors don't build factories in war zones. Tourism collapses. Infrastructure gets destroyed faster than it can be rebuilt. This perpetuates poverty, which creates more instability, which drives more illegal activity, including more demand for weapons. It's a vicious cycle. There's also the corruption factor. The illegal arms trade doesn't just involve weapons. It requires corrupt officials at every level: border guards, customs agents, police, military officers, sometimes even judges and politicians. When corruption becomes endemic, it undermines the entire governance structure. People lose faith in institutions. The rule of law erodes, and once corruption takes hold, it spreads to other areas. An official who takes bribes to let weapons through will also take bribes to let drugs through, to ignore human trafficking, to overlook environmental crimes. For countries directly affected by weapons trafficking, particularly those receiving rather than supplying, the impact is devastating. Mexico's cartel violence, fueled largely by American weapons, has killed hundreds of thousands of people over the past 2 decades. Entire regions are effectively controlled by criminal organizations. The state has lost its monopoly on violence. In some areas, the cartels are better armed than the police. That's not hyperbole. Cartel enforcers sometimes have military-grade weapons that outgun local law enforcement. The same pattern plays out in parts of Central America, in regions of Africa, in areas of the Middle East. When non-state armed groups have access to military-grade weapons, they can challenge or even defeat state security forces. This creates zones of contested sovereignty where the government exists in name but doesn't actually control the territory. And there's a direct connection to other forms of transnational crime. The networks that move weapons also move drugs, people, and other contraband. A trafficker who smuggles guns from Texas to Mexico on the southbound trip might smuggle drugs from Mexico to Texas on the northbound trip. The infrastructure is the same. The corruption that enables one kind of smuggling enables all kinds. This is why you can't think about the illegal arms trade in isolation. It's part of a broader ecosystem of illicit activity that includes drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering, and organized crime. They're all connected, and they all reinforce each other. For ordinary citizens in consuming countries, the most direct impact is crime. Illegal guns in the hands of gangs mean more shootings, more homicides, more fear. Neighborhoods that might otherwise be relatively safe become dangerous. Businesses leave, property values decline, and the cycle continues. But here's the question we have to confront honestly. Can this actually be stopped? Is there any realistic path to significantly reducing the illegal arms trade, or is this just a permanent feature of the modern world that we have to accept and manage? The uncomfortable truth is that completely eliminating illegal arms trafficking is probably impossible. As long as there's demand, there will be supply. As long as there are price differentials between jurisdictions, there will be arbitrage opportunities. As long as borders exist and some are poorly monitored, there will be smuggling. But that doesn't mean nothing can be done. There are interventions that could significantly reduce the scale of the problem, even if they can't eliminate it entirely. Stronger regulations on legal purchases in source countries would help. The United States could close loopholes that allow straw purchasing, universal background checks, waiting periods, limits on the number of firearms one person can purchase in a given time period, All of these would make trafficking marginally harder. Not impossible, but harder. And when you're dealing with a distributed problem, small marginal increases in difficulty can have significant cumulative effects. Better tracking and tracing systems would help law enforcement connect seized weapons back to their point of origin and identify trafficking patterns. Some countries already require detailed record keeping and ballistic fingerprinting. Expanding these systems globally and ensuring they're actually enforced would create better intelligence. Increased resources for enforcement at borders and ports would help. More inspections, better scanning technology, more personnel, all of this would increase the interdiction rate. Even if you can't catch everything, catching more sends a signal and increases costs for traffickers. International cooperation could be improved dramatically, streamlining information sharing, creating joint task forces, harmonizing legal frameworks so that prosecution is easier across jurisdictions. All of this would make enforcement more effective. But here's the hard part. All of these interventions require political will, and political will is often lacking because the costs are immediate and concentrated, while the benefits are diffuse and long-term. A politician who pushes for stricter gun regulations faces backlash from gun rights advocates and industry groups. A government that invests heavily in border enforcement has to take money from other priorities. Countries have to cooperate even when they have competing interests. And perhaps most fundamentally, you'd need to address the underlying demand. As long as there are conflicts, as long as there are criminal organizations operating in environments where violence is necessary for survival, there will be demand for weapons. Reducing that demand requires addressing the root causes of conflict, reducing poverty, strengthening governance, fighting corruption, creating economic opportunities. Those are generational projects, not quick fixes. So we're left with a sobering reality. The illegal arms trade will continue because the incentives that sustain it are deeply embedded in the structure of the global economy and the international system. Progress is possible, but it will be incremental, uneven, and constantly challenged by actors who benefit from the status quo. Let's bring it all together. We've seen how illegal weapons start overwhelmingly as legal products, purchased legally in the United States and trafficked south into Mexico and Central America, bought in Paraguay and smuggled into Brazil, looted from poorly secured stockpiles in Libya and spread across the Sahel, diverted from Cold War depots in Eastern Europe and sold into the Balkans. We've seen how North Korea exports not just weapons, but weapons manufacturing capability to Africa, how Iran ships arms to proxies across the Middle East, how the collapse of Afghanistan put massive quantities of American military equipment into Taliban hands. We've seen the routes: trans-Saharan convoys, small boats crossing the Adriatic, container ships passing through the Strait of Malacca, trucks driving across the Afghan-Pakistani frontier. We've seen how the same networks that move drugs also move guns because both depend on corruption and both generate profit. We've seen the end users: cartels in Mexico, gangs in Jamaica, jihadist groups in the Sahel, ethnic militias in Myanmar, organized crime in Europe. And we've seen why the system persists. Because every actor has rational incentives to participate, because enforcement is resource-intensive and often ineffective, because international cooperation is slow, because legal industries benefit from lax regulations, because underlying conflicts create constant demand. The next time you hear about a weapons seizure or a gun trafficking bust, you'll understand what that really represents. It's not the system breaking down, it's a tiny fraction of the flow being interrupted while the rest continues unimpeded. It's enforcement theater that creates the appearance of control while the underlying trade adapts and continues. This is how the global illegal arms trade actually works, and this is why it's so difficult to stop. Now let's shift to Europe, where the dynamics are completely different because Europe isn't experiencing major wars right now, and most European countries have relatively strict gun control laws.